Hi there and welcome. This is Roberta Bradley, broker owner of At Home Realty Group. Welcome to At Home with Roberta. Today I would like to go over the consent to limited representation form. This form states that the broker represents both the seller and the buyer, or both landlord and tenant. This document is very important to have implemented in the event that the broker is representing both the buyer and the seller, or the landlord and the tenant, as stated. So let's get started. On this line, you're going to have the buyer and tenant information, or tenant, excuse me. On line 2, the seller or the landlord. Line 3, the subject property. Number 4, this is where you're going to have the firm name of the broker that is going to be representing both sides. Consent. Buyer and seller consent that broker acting through the licensee or licensees named below will represent both parties in the transaction. Line 6 is if there is only one licensee that's going to be representing both parties. And line 2 is if there's 2 licensees that will be representing each party, but both employed by the same broker. They will be detailed here as to who will be representing the buyer and who will be representing the seller. The duties and limitations. The broker now represents both buyer and seller, and both parties understand that neither broker nor broker's licensee or licensees can represent the interests of one party to the exclusion or detriment of the other party. The parties understand and further consent to the following. A. The licensee or each licensee represents both the buyer and the seller with limitations of the duties owed to the buyer and the seller, such as 1. The licensee or licensees will not, without written authorization, disclose to the other party that the seller will accept a price or terms other than that stated in the listing, or that the buyer will accept a price or terms other than offered. 2. There will be conflicts in the duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, and confidentiality. Disclosure of confidential information may be made only with written authorization. This does not relieve each licensee of any legal obligation to disclose all known facts which materially and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by any party to the transaction. 3. Pursuant to ARS Code 32-2156, sellers, lessors, and broker or licensee are not obligated to disclose that the subject property is or has been 1. The site of a natural death, suicide, homicide, or any crime classified as a felony. 2. Owned or occupied by a person exposed to HIV or diagnosed as having AIDS or any other disease not known to be transmitted through common occupancy of real estate. Or 3. Located in the vicinity of a sex offender. B. The licensee or licensees shall exercise reasonable skill and care in the performance of their duties. C. The licensee or licensees shall be obligated at all times to deal honestly with all parties. D. The duty of the licensee or licensees in this transaction do not relieve the seller or the buyer from the responsibility to protect their own interests. Compensation. Compensation to the broker shall be paid pursuant to separate agreements. Prior to agreements, seller and buyer understand this consent does not replace prior agreements entered into with broker, and such agreements shall remain in effect. However, to the extent that the terms of this consent contradict or conflict with the terms of prior agreements, This consent shall supersede. Termination. If the seller and buyer do not enter into a contract relating to the subject property, or if the transaction between the seller and the buyer fails to close, the parties agree that this consent is terminated, and the parties shall have no further rights or obligations pursuant to this consent. Indemnification. Seller and buyer agree to indemnify and hold broker harmless against any and all claims, damages, losses, expenses, or liabilities, including attorney's fees and costs incurred by broker in any defense thereof arising from broker's role of limited representation. Down here on the bottom is where the undersigned parties acknowledge that they have thoroughly read, understood, and approved this consent, and acknowledge receipt of a copy of this document. So this document gives us the authority to conduct limited representation between both the buyer and seller, or landlord and tenant, and outlines everybody's responsibilities. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hit the like button, subscribe, and don't forget to follow along for more tips.